Good evening. I'm Milton Curry, and Frida Escobedo is on my left. Pedro Reyes is in a little bit of Mexico City traffic and will be joining us shortly. Thank you for coming. We're going to just give a little bit of a 3 to 5 minute presentation each, and then we're going to have an open discussion and invite you to ask questions along the way. And hopefully Pedro will join us. When he does, he'll give his presentation. We'll resume our discussion. So I'm Milton Curry. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture at USC. I work in critical theory, urbanism, race, and class, and I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to get started just by talking a little bit about the things that are top of mind for me at the moment, and get started. So we decided to look at the topics of how human agency is, in fact, thought about today as being a part of discussions around social concerns in architecture, and how those get represented, how those get articulated, how those get executed in built work. Thank you. And I'm going to go through about 4 thoughts, and then I'm going to go a little bit deeper on 2 of them. I'm going to do it all in 5 minutes, so bear with me. I always like to start with this quote by artist Mark Bradford, that where he says, "I want to engage a social political conversation about the contemporary world that I live in or my relationship to it, and at the same time I want to abstract it." And I think at this critical political moment, marshaling the full senses of our humanity and the capacity of symbolic representation are key in affecting change in our society. And so this notion of abstraction and human agency, our senses, the smell, taste, look, what our bodies are feeling, holding those 2 together simultaneously, I think, is very critical at this political moment. When we think about Parasite, did anybody see the movie Parasite? How many people saw Parasite? Okay. Smell. Distinguishing people and their class status and their ability or their legitimacy to be in a certain space through a smell was very important in that movie, in terms of, in a way, dismissing the humanity of one of the central characters. And so that's just one example. Another aspect of this is the translation of social effects onto individual senses, and how these have historically and contemporaneously been important to social movements throughout history. In this diagram from, I believe, Jacqueline Rose, we see that there's something that happens between our visual acuity and our reception of something other to our own internal visual sensibility. And in that exchange, it's not just a transaction of receiving an image, but there's actually something that goes on between the image and our retina, between our mind and the image. And we often conceal that or believe that that's invisible, and it's just an automatic transaction. There's actually something always going on in that intermediary space, and so that's very important. The other aspect is thinking about the 2 things I just mentioned and how to represent them. And we're architects on this stage, and I'm always like to go back to the Manhattan Transcripts, this series that Bernard Tschumi developed in the 80s to try to depict violence in Manhattan, and trying to diagram and use architectural language to depict a particular kind of experience, and to somehow represent that experience using the abstraction of architectural representation, but also using collage very strategically to think about how that experience gets mapped into the abstraction of architecture. And so the idea of a language, a lexicon to describe experience, is something that's very important. And finally, thinking about architecture as a discipline as not something that is deterministic so much as it is relational. In other words, not that we build a piece of concrete and steel and that's deterministic of planting materials in space and dictating movement, but in fact thinking about architecture as a discourse that is in fact modulating and translating relationships between people, relationships between space and people, between the visual and the collective, between the individual and the collective. And so that's something that I think is very important. Of course, here in Mexico City, we have a history of visual propaganda and co-optation of symbols, in this case the 1968 Olympics, and the expressions that are in the advertising for the different events being co-opted within a political strategy to bring emotional resonance to student movement and student protest. And of course, in the United States, we have the Black Panther movement. And what was very important in that civil rights movement was the ability to express and to extract emotion through propaganda posters and in a way kind of expressionistic, colorful representations of various things that were being experienced by Black Americans. And in a way, recalling some of the work theoretically that was done in different periods of time to see how we can deal with the situation today, we often think about the notion of the subaltern and the notion of the Gayatri Spivak gave us about how to think about those that are marginalized. And it's very much about a notion of being between patriarchy and imperialism, between tradition and modernism. Between these two things, the subject is in formation. And so the idea of the Olympics on the one hand, the freedom, the constraints of the political and the social and the economic on the other hand, those are two simultaneous forces that are at work as we're forming as subjects. And so I think that that's very important for thinking about where we go today. You can't see these, but on the left, in a journal that I started called Critical Productive, in the middle piece there's the beginning of a section on the march from Montgomery to Selma and how the highway, in fact, during the Lyndon Johnson administration, was developed to move people through the landscape and begin to see the landscape as in a way, something that would be very American, would be very idyllic. And the use of the highway, a public space, to enact a march, and then again to put one's body, human agency, on the line and get beaten, moving through that public space, legislated by a state to actually begin to see America as a very idyllic, through the lens of a very idyllic landscape. That's a kind of politicizing of human agency and urban space, architectural space, that we can see from historical examples. So with that, I want to leave space for my colleagues, and I think we'll come back to some of these hopefully in discussion. So thank you.
Well, is this working? Yeah? Thank you. I think this is better. Thanks. Well, thank you, Milton, for the invitation for this talk. It's really nice discussing ideas with you. And I think I have another exercise, as you were mentioning, on mapping and power. And now that you mentioned this idea of hidden spaces and the relationships of power that happen within space, we have a multidisciplinary practice. This is a small studio. I'm based in Mexico City. For those who don't know me, I'm an architect. And we work across very different types of scales and projects. But also what I do is that I teach, and we try to incorporate these ideas of what we investigate in studios into the work of the office and the other way around. Every time we design something, we try to question it. And this publication that happened 2 years ago, it was an initiative with Instituto de Investigaciones Independientes that was led by Javier Nueno and Luciano Concheiro. It started as a conversation between Luciano and me, discussing this idea of a house I designed in 2007, one of my very early projects. It was a house in Ordos, Mongolia. It was a project that was proposed by Ai Weiwei and Herzog and de Miron. It was a huge compound of 100 houses designed by 100 different architects. And what was really interesting, and you can barely see the floor plans, was that when we received the brief for the project, we had 2 kitchens, and I thought it was a mistake. Like, why would you have 2 kitchens? Like, this is, like, maybe you made a mistake. And there was a Western-style kitchen and an Eastern-style kitchen. And when I called to clarify, they mentioned, like, no, this is correct. Like, there's one kitchen that will be used for actually preparing the food, and then one that is going to be just for displaying the food and to receive people. So that just really stuck in my mind, and the strategy that I developed at the time was just like to design 2 houses in one. So it was like a tiny little concrete house inside something that would look more like a pavilion, something that would incorporate more into the landscape. These were like the initial drawings, and I'm not going to linger in this project, but the idea was like the occupied house, like the owner's house would be more like this pavilion that was surrounding the operative house of concrete, the house of the kitchen, the original kitchen. And after having this conversation many years after, with Luciano, the movie Roma appeared, and it was a huge success, and it just initiated like this whole debate on what domestic labor and space is in terms of architecture. And as you can see in this scene, this is the last scene of the movie where Cleo, the protagonist, is just walking into her room. This is a map of the house, and as you can see, I don't know if there's a pointer here, but well, on the left corner you can see that there's a little addition of the house. So there are these spaces that sometimes are embedded within the domestic space, sometimes they're a little bit separated, and it was a little bit similar as the exercise we did for Ordos 100. But there are spaces that are very iconic in Mexico City, that we perceive as this stereotypical emotional architecture, as Luis Barragan was mentioning, like this is the idea of the space for expression, the space for color, the space for the senses, that has this other aspect to it, the pragmatic, the domestic labor is embedded within it. And what people don't know about this house, or many people don't know, is that there is a house within the house. Luis Barragan designed this home for himself. The kitchen is still operating because when he passed away, he gave this part of the house, the domestic labor quarters, to the person that was taking care of him for many, many years. So this is still an occupied house. It's a house that has never been photographed. So to me, this is like a mystery, like the house of Barragan that we don't know. And I always wonder if he used the same details, the same colors, the same proportions, as he did in the same spaces that we see in this picture. There are a series of corridors and hallways, and if you have the chance to visit the house, completely disguise the kitchen and all these operative rooms from the rest of the house. So it's almost like Luis Barragan was choreographing the house in such a way that domestic labor could be concealed. And to me, that was something that was not new, But until I did this exercise of designing a house myself, really emerged, and it started like this question in my head of how these relationships of power have been dominating and obscuring this very important house that happens within the realm of the domestic space. So we started doing this research with Javiera and Luciano that turned into that publication, and then this semester, during my class at Harvard GSD, we worked with a number of students just trying to understand the different relationships, because that kind of relationship does not just work within the intimate private space of the home. It also happens at a scale of an urban, like dynamic. When we see projects, for example, in Mexico, such as the Metrobus being stopped, for example, in Reforma in Lomas, because people don't want to see public transportation near their domestic areas. It's a kind of similar dynamic of hiding or disguising the operation that needs to happen for a system of a city to operate. So we started analyzing these 4 buildings. One is Casa Luis Barragan, and there's a house of a building by Mario Pani. There's a very interesting exercise in Polanco that has a separate building for domestic workers inside the same block of Polanco. And then, of course, developments that are much larger, such as Bosque Real. So this turned into a publication that analyzed all these spaces and how walls could be concealing these kind of dynamics. Know that the hidden bell that is under a table to call the cook for her to serve, all these operations and installations and dynamics that happen that are not really like seen by the naked eye. And for example, this is another example of a larger scale. This is Bosque Real, one of the fanciest neighborhoods. You can see it in the propaganda, no? Where do you live? I live in Bosque Real. It's like this ideal space where everyone wants to live. But as you can see, the propaganda is facing the hills as if the city didn't exist, which is kind of funny, because if you see the map, it's a very dense area, so they're just facing the other way around. And this is the actual condition of the space, which is basically just like hiding under a door, the kitchen. It's the same thing, but at an urban scale. And as you can see, there's a tiny little door here. It's almost imperceptible, but it turns out that that door is also an operational, like an operative door. This is the photograph of the space. So that was when Bosque Real was still under construction, and this was an entrance for domestic workers into the space. So this kind of dynamic happens in every scales in the city. And it became really relevant for me to start analyzing these dynamics, especially this year, because this is the first time in the history of the country that domestic labor is considered formal labor. Before this year, it was considered informal work. So it's just now that the Union of Domestic Workers have been allying, and it's being recognized. The law 189 has been approved, so now they are able to get social security, a pension, and all these rights that every worker has, but because they were not formal, they didn't have. And while we were doing this exercise at the university, there were some really interesting examples and analysis. I'm just going to show a couple. One of the teams developed this mapping technique of every single tower that is being developed in Mexico City. And what they did was to analyze the domestic quarters in relationship to the rest of the apartments. And what they were trying to prove is that not necessarily the best strategy is to make it as small as possible, to keep it in the darkest place as possible. They reconfigured the tower. They were retrofitting the tower to make it more efficient, and the result was to have like a micro building within the building. So it was like having a micro community of domestic workers, allowing them to own the space or to bring their families in. It was an utopian exercise, but it was really interesting to see how, using the same type of space, they could really reconfigure that relationship of power in a different way. And another exercise was just to understand how these invisibilization also happened in the public sphere. So this team, what they did was that they mapped all the places of reunion for the Union of Domestic Workers. They usually gather in public parks because they're women. They usually need an open space because they have kids and they have to bring them in. The other way that they can gather is that they borrow from other unions their collective spaces, and that has to happen on Sundays because that's when the other unions don't work. So they need to use their only free day to get together and just try to fight for the rights. So what they did was that they utilized this market. It's in a very complicated intersection that has informal markets, public transportation hub, and what they did was try to make the market more efficient by introducing the program of the union and extending the neighboring park, so the domestic workers really could just bring their kids in. They would have a safe space for women, not just from the union, but everyone that should come here. I mean, the analysis can be expanded, but the idea of how we understand public spaces and architecture was like the interest, and I think it relates to what Milton was saying. It's just a way of looking at architecture, not by making space, but also by understanding space, and I think that's what we want to discuss here today. Thank you.
So just maybe a question of, because the project of analysis and speculation by students is really thought-provoking. In practice, how do you think architecture can be more proactive in addressing the structural issues? So from my perspective, some of my current work is on actually drawing from philosophy and epistemology and thinking about new work on by Miranda Fricker and Christy Dodson on epistemic oppression and epistemic injustice, which really addresses how do we construct knowledge and who's credible, who's deemed credible in the construction of knowledge. And that, I mean, for our discipline, it's who gets to construct the history of domestic architecture. I mean, who gets to do that? Who gets to construct knowledge of, you know, where we take our pedagogies? And so that's a question from a more kind of philosophical perspective, but I'm wondering from a practitioner perspective, how do you think about the structural inequalities that, or the structural issues that you're addressing in your work? Welcome, Pedro.
Hola, Pedro. Well, I think, as you were mentioning, that the way that we've been designing domestic spaces is basically through the male gaze. No, like it's through the male perspective that we've been designing what life should be and how we should be organizing. It's until very recent days that the female gaze is being visibilized as well. But it also comes from a position of privilege. No, it's not that we're considering the true residents of the home. And sometimes if you think about it, domestic workers spend more time in the house than the actual owners. So for me, it really challenges the whole idea of property and, you know, like the idea of territory. So I think it's just like that. It goes back to the idea of private property in the end. But I think if we understand that, then maybe we can rethink the idea of how we can create profit from that. And the example that these students did, just like reconfiguring this tower, it was a super high-end tower, Mítica, one of the tallest towers in Mexico City and Latin America in general, was to allow this idea of, well, if the domestic workers now are being formalized and they have access to credits and to a pension and to bring their families home and so on, there's an opportunity for these developers to be looking at that as a part of the solution and not as a part of the problem that needs to be hidden under the closet. You can change the typology, but then we need to think about like in the terms that we are thinking design, architectural design. Design is also policy making, and it's also about asking these questions in school. As I think this is a fundamental thing, no? If we only think that design is choosing materials and colors and forms and this kind of like very old-fashioned and technology and incorporating technology into the equation, we're missing a very important part of understanding the human habitat, no? And the dynamics that happen within space.
¿Estamos haciendo esto en español o en inglés? It's in English. Sorry for being late. I was talking to traffic. Okay. It's a reverb. Okay. So well, because I arrived late, I don't know if it is pertinent to the subject, but I understand that, you know, like there was like some concern, like we were addressing issues of activism, and I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about a very recent, well, it's not even a recent project, actually it's a project that is starting next week, which talks about a habitat, but a very large habitat, which is the planet itself, and the subject of nuclear war, and basically also because I understand that we were talking about like the connection between like the senses and social issues. So basically I was given an assignment that was to make visible the threat of nuclear war, which is invisible. Invisible mainly because it was something that we kind of forgot. There was like a high awareness of this in the 70s and 80s. Is this moving? I don't know how to click. It's like, oh yeah. Okay, so, but actually, you know, like the fact that this is out of sight doesn't mean that it's not real. There's over 13,000 nukes in the world. You can see that most of them are in Russia and the United States, well, and as well as in France, China, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and a number of others deployed across other cities or other countries. And all the people who is in control of nuclear arsenals is crazy. Look at these guys. Like they're all crazy, right? So if they have been so consistent in like doing everything wrong, why should we trust them with nuclear weapons? No? So there is another factor, which is, you know, like three factors. One is political instability, the other is climate change, and also artificial intelligence that increases makes this threat kind of a very dangerous again, more dangerous. And the organization that I'm working is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was formed after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the same physicists that were part of the Manhattan Project, and they suddenly regret their invention. And actually it was the wife of one of the physicists who came up with a device, because how to make this visible, and how to make it even also kind of a, you know, like time is also one sense. You know, like it is a myth that we have 5 senses. There's many senses, and one of them is the idea of time. No, well, the sense of time. We have a sense that tells us we can measure a minute with our own body without need of a clock. We have a kind of roughly. So in order to convey that, the doomsday clock was created, which is basically a clock to tell how close we are from midnight, and midnight is kaboom. So last year it was 2 minutes from to midnight, and this, in January 23rd, like a week ago, the clock was advanced 100 seconds to midnight, and it's never been that close. And this is because, so it's time to ban nuclear weapons, but the reason why is this kind of so close is because all the countries, there's a conference at the United Nations in April, the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the United States is withdrawing and other countries will withdraw, which means that all the preventions that were in place in order to keep those nukes there are now gone. So this will increase the risk of, there's a river noise, yeah? So the sculpture that, is curious because the kind of previous campaigns that were happening in the 60s, etc., 70s and 80s, didn't use the mushroom cloud. But, given what is at stake, I decided to go and use the mushroom cloud just to remind people of how it looks, because people don't think of the mushroom cloud anymore as a kind of symbol of what the kind of explosions look like, etc. So also we have a portable museum of 75 years of anti-nuclear activism that includes all kind of paraphernalia like bottoms, posters, banners, etc., movies, songs. There's a big cultural production that has been part of this. And next Friday, this is an academic symposium that is happening on Thursday, but, click. Can we pass it next? Okay. So on Friday, there's a happening that invite you all to come at Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco, which is the 14th anniversary of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And the Treaty of Tlatelolco is something that Mexico promoted in 1967. Where we persuaded all the other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to join this treaty to create a nuclear-free zone. And the nuclear-free zone is not necessarily because we wanted to have a bomb, but because the United States is very active in creating nuclear base, like military bases all around the world. So they go often with a country and they say, let us have a military base in your territory and we'll build you one for you. And that's how they have, put military bases all around the planet. But through this treaty, we kind of block the way for having any kind of military weapons deployed in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we're going to have a performance with a dance company called Snowboards, with also music by a doom band. It's going to be a very apocalyptic event, and costume design by Carla Fernandez, and then film screenings of all the movies about the nuclear war. On Saturday and Sunday, we're going to have some movies. So then starts a kind of a world tour where this thing is going to be to Milan, and then it goes to Times Square in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference, and with the collaboration with ICANN, which is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, we're going to install this in Times Square, and then that's going to be the point of departure of a march that we're going to do from Times Square to United Nations, which is a straight line. It's only 20 minutes walk, but it's basically trying to bring this visible, make this visible. And basically because there's also a very important element of also involving the senses, which is when you go and chant in a march, you connect your body with your mind and a cause. So, and you are together in a crowd that is connected with the same concern, same effort, same spirit, same energy, and that is a transformative experience. So it's always very important that, especially in a time where most of our activism happens by sharing a post on Facebook or something like that, to actually take the streets and do this and put your body in the street and be together with other people. So that is like hopefully only the beginning of a movement. Well, there's already a movement, but the idea is like same as other artists were involved in the past, to also kind of get like some of what art can do in the service of these issues, to make this issue visible.
So I think this is relevant also to maybe a rebirth, at least from perspective in the United States, of marching. Black Lives Matter started or was instigated by Trayvon Martin being killed in public space, and so the idea of property, who gets to construct the knowledge of the city, and I think the questions that emerged from his unfortunate death were who controls the city, who controls bodies in space, and I think that led to, in a way, Black Lives Matter, and then their significant kind of marching in Ferguson and other places that then exposed the kind of invisibility of surveillance and other forms of violence. Yet they had a booth at Miami Art Basel, Black Lives Matter, which I think is a very interesting phenomena of a social movement that starts very specifically out of a kind of violent response or reaction to a violent condition, and then becomes a kind of productive gesture that is actually about aesthetics and culture and cultural production. So I think the idea of using space being catalyzed by architectural space, urban space, to then symbolically represent through visuality and other kinds of forms of production, and then flipping that to be a very productive space of making the collective, of making new knowledge. And I think that's very similar to what you're doing and what Frida's doing in terms of the invisibility is an analysis that then moves to something very productive in terms of new paradigms and new typologies. So I think these are very optimistic actions that both of you are taking.
Yes, maybe, yeah, we can open it to questions. But I think, yes, what you were saying, and the idea of invisibilization is probably one of the biggest forms of violence and one of the strongest one, because then everything that follows in that line is erased completely. So I think it's like the first step, no, like to recognize this problem, and that is also an opportunity for design, no, and for change. También puede ser en español. ¿Sí?
Talking about, like, now that you mentioned, for instance, like Black Lives Matter and Trayvon Martin, etc. I think that there's like a number of devices that have been very helpful in order to make injustice visible, no? And they deal with space, and they deal with the body, and they deal with kind of oppression, no? I mean, like, like a case study that has been over and over, kind of set as kind of a very crucial was, and that I've been thinking, for instance, in the context of, actually this is like a question that maybe we could discuss here, because, for instance, like if you think now in detention centers, where there's like all this kind of literally like, there's like this debate, no, whether they should be called concentration camps, no? And I was thinking about the slave ship diagram, you know, like that was very helpful, you know, like to show the horrors of slavery. And I was asking myself, what would it be like a graphic image that would like give like a visual representation to the fact that there's 80,000 kids on the these places, no, that are in these concentration camps. I mean, Mexico, unfortunately, in order to sign the free trade treaty, was then given like a task to do the same with the Central American migrants that are now passing through our territory. So we are not doing a very good job at keeping also the safety of the human lives that are people who are going through our territory, and then there's now military forces that are pushing them back into Guatemala, and Guatemala is forced to do these kind of things, etc. And there's for instance, I attempted to do a print precisely because, for instance, that was a map of Central America that was filled with type of all the military interventions that the United States had in Central America since 200 years to now, just to show that the problem of migration started with, this kind of basically after, well, the kind of it was since companies like United Fruit, or the repression of all the guerrilla movements in Central America, etc. That was, has been destroying so many of the more efforts in Central America to have a kind of a life of their own without these oppression forces, and that have obliged, also the fact that, for instance, people who are put in jail in the United States then are sent back to Central America, and so someone who is a kind of cycle where there's a certain responsibility to that migration factor. So it's not, there's so many things that are not kind of easily understood, because, for instance, there's always these double standards. More people from the United States have moved to Mexico in the last 5 years than the way around, and they all overstay their visas. So, and it's we're very, very relaxed about their overstay. So it's not a legal issue, it's a racial issue. Is the fact that they are, entering the territory and that they are looking for jobs, etc., is not a reason to treat them that way, but such a simple fact, people still don't get it. So, a lot of people may say, oh, well, they deserve it because they came without a permit. And I often say, well, maybe what we should do is to ask some of our friends who are from the United States here, and maybe we could do a kind of a invisible theater kind of a thing when we put kids from the United States in jail, in kind of cages, and then we don't need 80,000, we only need 7, and that would be oh, we already have a concentration camp of little American kids here in Mexico. Maybe that would be a kind of a role reversal that would highlight bring awareness to the issue. But that's a very punk idea, but that's just an idea.
But I think you introduced the political dimension of knowledge creation. The leaders that you talked about on the screen, and how we're now in a period of really the construction of knowledge is not in credible hands many times at this political moment, and so the idea of counter narratives, of counter constructions of knowledge in ways and mediums that maybe are open. Maybe the public is more open to the medium of architecture, speaking through its representations in a way that is more entering the mainstream maelstrom of of representations that the public looks to for knowledge creation. So it was previously the newsprint and the newspaper, and now it's quite mixed, social media and other things, and visual media and television. But maybe architecture can use its medium to now enter into that mechanism to try to counter some of the knowledge creation that maybe is not authentic or real or is false.
I think that's why it was so interesting that you mentioned the movie Parasite, because I think, I mean, they're completely different movies, but they have this a similar topic, which is domestic labor and these relationships of power that are personified by the house itself, especially in Parasite, no, where you see this beautiful house designed by an architect, a famous architect, that has a hidden space, no, the space of domination, and everything seems to be working perfectly fine, but then there are certain things that are not shown until something bad happens, no? But this idea of something bad happens is just when you manifest and protest and bring it to the streets and create this kind of friction. But when friction is not happening because the domination is still working, then how can we create public spaces where friction can make these things that happen in private public? No, and that's a thing that has to do with race, but also with gender. No, like this is a topic that has been especially complicated for women because typically the public spaces are spaces of friction, but just for groups of men and not necessarily for women. We've seen in Mexico City, especially in the past few months, how when the spaces are taken by women, the repression is immediate to erase this kind of protests, no? Like we see, I live in front of Ángel de la Independencia, which is a monument that was taken by these protesters, and it was graffitied, and this was fenced immediately with the excuse that it was going to be restored anyway, as all the monuments in Reforma, and I don't know, the Monumento a Colón, and so many other monuments have been restored, but actually there has not been one single person restoring Ángel de la Independencia since they put the fence around it. But it's just a way to conceal these graffitis and to avoid for people to keep graffitiing it. It was really fascinating also to see how the police station that was taken by these women was painted just a few seconds after the protesters left, and it was like really a matter of seconds. I mean, if the government had that type of response for any of the problems in the city, it would be a completely different nation, no? And this is the kind of oppression that you see in public space, but it's actually erasing the friction, no?
Questions, no?
Hi. I'm just interested if you have any particular examples or just feedback from working in this space between architecture and art, and then coming from this idea of private and public property, and finding a private and public property in both built spaces but also knowledge, and what kind of access we can have. So for example, having these conversations in a space like a fair, so this is public and private at the same time, you know? And there's this interesting dynamic between architecture and art where you step more into architecture in a space that might be more public, whereas art in a museum, I know both of you work in these in-betweens and even in the universities as well. So I'm just curious, from your experience in different projects, what is the ideal space in a way, or what ideas have you come up with of where this conversation can be more fluid between all different kinds of publics? I don't know if that's a little all over the place, but
I don't think there's a space, one single space, no? That I believe in this idea of the cross-section between all these spaces, and that's one of the reasons why I insist that in the office we keep working in different scales and that we keep engaging with these things. And the way for me to do it was academia, no? Like it's very difficult to try to do it on your own if you have a studio, like especially if you've never like had like a super huge corporative office, you know, like you don't have the resources to pull that out. And what I've seen is that the work with the students really helped me to see opportunities that I've never seen. And when they come to Mexico, they come with fresh eyes, but also we try to link them to institutions that can talk to them. Sometimes it's difficult because there's a language barrier and a cultural barrier and so on. But I think you need to address all these actors in the field, and that's why I find architecture to be so fascinating. No, it's not about just building something, but also to understand space. I think the notion of architecture should change today, and what Pedro is doing sometimes is very architectural and very spatial, and I feel like he's doing more architectural work that I'm doing sometimes, no? Or Milton also, because he's really pushing the boundary of how we understand space. So the traditional idea of architecture is what we should eliminate right now. We don't need to build anymore. Like that is not something that we need. That's something that we want to do, but we should rethink what design is and what the design problem is right now. No?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know at USC in Southern California at the architecture school where I'm dean, we talk about educating citizen architects. And when I first said that, it's not a term that it's a term that has been used before, but can be adjusted and adapted, I think. But it's really about being more porous between the university and all constituencies. And so we're not there yet, but moving to, instead of an architecture jury where you have, 10 people in suits or 10 people, usually 9 males and maybe 1 female, that we have people from the community. If it's a project that's talking about space and, in the community, that you have people from nonprofits, people who are activists, just to make the space of critique, the space of knowledge creation more porous. I think what we find is that in spaces of architecture schools, we're talking in very isolated and siloed ways, and then knowledge is created, and then we go out and from that silo and then try to engage other constituencies. But they're not in on the ground floor. And so I think that's, the idea that we're trying to make pedagogy much more porous at the time of its creation, as opposed to we're going to create knowledge and then we're going to go out and try to collaborate with people who we think should be interacting with us. We've already created the knowledge ourselves. So that's one kind of posture, intellectual posture, I think, that we're trying to change.
Well, since we're talking about public space, and connecting back to the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco, we all know it basically for the event of the 2 of October, no, the massacre of the students in '68. And Tlatelolco's name is always associated with that, no? So, it's very interesting that just 1 year before, in '67, it was like the place, if you visit the square, there's like these kind of poles for the flags, and there's 33 poles, and they were put in '67 precisely because every year on the 14th of February they put up the flags to celebrate the signage of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Well, this was the original intention. So it's very curious because just a year after, the meaning of that square, which was devoted to peace, changed entirely, and it's curious because when we talk about memory, oftentimes memory is about the memory of tragedy. So we talk about it's important to remind us that this happened here, so it never happens again. And in Mexico, we're very good at that. At remind us about Ayotzinapa and Tlatelolco and and the times where the state has made a crime, a state crime. Actually, I think that we're much better at like kind of reminding ourselves about like our failures, and we have a harder time reminding ourselves about our successes. It's like a kind of we're very self-critical, I think, in Mexico. I realized that, for instance, like working in Japan, I curated a triennial in the Aichi Triennial in Japan, where, for instance, like we were showing a work which touched a taboo in Japan, which is that taboo, you know, like it's an empire. Actually, it's the oldest empire in the world. You know, like there's a dynasty that goes back, you know, like many thousand years, and you know, like it's the oldest empire in the world. And an empire will always have a very hard time accepting their errors. So in the Korean War, in the 30s, well, actually for 30 years, Japan occupied Korea and China, and they did a lot of massacres, and in Korea specifically they had 200,000 sex slaves, which were called comfort women, and they were, you know, like abused by the Japanese military. And we were showing a sculpture that showed like a comfort woman, as they were called, and the museum started to be attacked by the public. You know, like the public started to threat that they would like burn the museum. Like peaceful Japan, you know, like they started to attack and call, and you know, like 7,000 calls were coming into the museum, because now Japan is a very right-wing and very nationalistic, extremely nationalistic country, and they have a really hard time accepting their errors. You know, like they just don't like to deal with it. And for me, it was like kind of then I like that kind of a compassion. Like to see how we deal, we had to shut down a part of the exhibition and organize a kind of a whole symposium on freedom of speech, and do a kind of an entire educational program, etc., to reopen the exhibition because of the threats of burning the museum in Japan, threats of terrorism by the public, which, you know, like never happened in Japan, never. And then I realized that in Mexico, you know, like we have a very kind of active and natural, you know, like a costumbre, like a custom to blame the government for everything, and like nobody like ever like kind of self-censorship themselves when it's about blaming the government. It's like a national sport. But we have a very hard time reminding ourselves when the government has done something successful. And the example is at Tlatelolco Plaza. You know, like it will always be the place where the students were shot by the army, or you know, like and for me it was interesting to suddenly be on the other side of memory, you know, like the memory of something that actually was positive. So it's just a reflection on the issue of the meaning of public space.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for coming. Great question, great conversation, Frida and Pedro, and I hope that you all and all of us will continue to discuss this and exchange ideas with one another. So thank you, and thank you to Tanya Ragasol and the fair, Zonomako, for allowing us to have this conversation here. Thank you.